York Times bestseller and internationally best-selling author of science fiction and fantasy whose books have been translated into over 30 languages. Her latest books are the fantasy adventures The Isle of the Gods and The Heart of the World. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm having so much fun here. I'm happy to be here.
My first question is, what drew you to writing?
Oh, what drew me to writing? I mean, I've just always told stories, you know. The first time I remember telling stories is in grade 2, when I used to pass the gum tree in our playground off as the magic faraway tree to my whole class and tell stories about the adventures I had up it. But I've always done it. I think for me, writing is something, and telling stories is something that for a long time before I was paid for it, I did it anyway, and I would do it if no one was paying me. I actually have to think about how I'm going to take holidays and breaks in a way that works, because often if I'm left with free time, I'll just spend it working on a story, which is not a break from what I'm doing the rest of the time. So it sounds really cheesy to say it's just in me, but I'm just a storyteller. That's just what I do.
I think we all had, when we were a child, we all just sort of wanted to tell stories to our friends, and the playground at school sort of is the gateway to telling stories.
And I think it's a part of who we are. And you know, when you're little, they're all plagiarized. Like the magic faraway tree. When you're little, they're all stolen from other places. But the act of piecing them together helps you learn the structure and how you make up your own. And then, you know, more original bits start to come in. You know, like my 5-year-old tells me stories all the time, and sometimes I recognise the DNA. But some of it just seems to have come from her. So I think, you know, you build it over time. It's a skill that kind of comes slowly.
I think having children as well is like a good little sparks of inspiration as well, because they have the best stories or make up the wildest things as well. I think you have to have this in my book.
You know what? I mean, so Lily Wilkinson in A Hunger of Thorns, she has said many times that there is a fabulous monster in that her son made up when he was 5, and Lily was like, can I please have that? Because the slugs on its back are amazing. And, you know, I'm working on a very junior series at the moment, and I frequently ask my 5-year-old, like, what about this? And she'll go, well, Mama, I think it should be. And, you know, a lot of it's just, you know what story it's come from, but every so often I'm like, may I have that, darling?
I always love hearing the stories that the kids come up with, because it's
wild. Yeah, in the best way.
What inspired the Isle of the Gods duology? I know that you had your background in sailing as well.
Yeah, I did. So I grew up sailing. I took my first steps on a boat. I sailed my whole life growing up, which it's funny because when I'm in America, I always have to sort of asterisk that, because in America, sailing seems to be quite a posh thing to do. That, you know, it's like pop collar and champagne and my hand on the wheel of a giant yacht. Whereas here, the whole of Australia lives on the coast. So many more people, you know, all you need is a dodgy old dinghy and you can go sailing. Like, it still doesn't mean everyone gets to do it, but it's a lot more accessible. And so I've discovered in America I have to be careful when I say I grew up sailing and took my first steps on a boat, that I'm not accidentally telling a story that sounds like I grew up very rich. Because newsflash, I did not. But yeah, I grew up sailing. I've always sailed. And in 2013, I was in New York for Book Expo America, and I was walking along the Hudson River, and I saw this big tall ship sailing down, and it was this incredible image. I took a photo of it, of the tall ship, and then the skyscrapers in the background, and my brain was like, what is that? Is that like Pirates of the Caribbean take Manhattan? Is that like, you know, are they time travelers? What's going on? And I started thinking about, like, what would it have taken for tall ships to still be sailing today? And so, you know, I found out that the reason they really stopped was reliability, that they were much cheaper than ships with an engine because they didn't need fuel. But if the wind stopped, so did they. And so I was like, well, because I'm a nerd, my answer was immediately, well, magicians is what would have kept that going. If you had magicians that controlled the wind and the waves, that would do it. And so I started thinking about that and thinking about, you know, some writers go character first and some go world first. And I sort of mix and match, but for me this time it was world first. And I started thinking, okay, who's interesting in that world? And I came up with this prince who is, you know, most magicians only have one element, but he has all of them because he's a royal magician, and it seems like everything should be perfect in his life, but of course it's not. And then I thought, the foil for him is this girl who grew up on these ships that are still going and who's deeply a part of them and who should have magic but doesn't, who, was born with the magician's markings on her arms, but then it never came. So she's the only person she knows who the magic never showed up, and she's literally got her failure as a magician written on her body. So she's quite grumpy a lot of the time. Not just for that reason, but also not for that reason. I started sort of building from there. It was a story I started working on in 2013, but wasn't good enough yet, because I didn't want it to be one where you had to really work to get okay, I've got to learn the world building and the gods and the magic and the politics and the war, I've got to really get all this in. I wanted it to just flow, to just be like a romp, but the problem is it does have all those things. So it was one of the first books I ever started properly working on, and it was published 10 years to the month after the first idea, because it took all that time to get good at it. It took all that time to get to the point where I could sort of effortlessly weave all that stuff in without you feeling like you just read an encyclopedia. So
was that through working with other authors as well, with your co-authoring with?
Oh, that's a great question. I think when we all learn a lot from each other when we co-author, I'm not sure if that's what I learned from my co-authors. We often talk about what did we teach each other, because I think you write with someone because you love their writing, and I think because on some level you sense that they have something that you don't, that the puzzle pieces would fit together. But then in each co-writing relationship I've had, as time has gone on, we've learned from each other so well that we don't really have those deficits anymore. But I think in terms of laying down information, it was just a case of doing it a lot. It was just a case of, this is my 8th series, and of just building all these worlds, because every one of them is set in a new world, and learning how to convey them and going through the editorial process for each one. And I think it's just an experience thing over time.
I think that you can't just stop at one. If it's difficult, you have to just keep going.
Oh, for sure, yeah. So Ira Glass, who is, he does This American Life on Chicago Public Radio, and he talks about the idea of the taste gap. And he says the taste gap is when you've probably heard this before, but for those who are watching us, is when your taste is better than what you can currently do. So, you're on one side of the taste gap and you look at your work and you don't think it's good. And he says that moment is good news, because that means you do know what good would be. You know what good would look like. You just can't get there yet. And that's okay, because you can learn skills and navigate a course to get to good. But you can't do that if you don't know what it looks like. If you're looking at your early stuff and being flawless, then that's actually not as good, because it means you don't know how to improve or what to work towards. So yeah.
What's your writing process like? Do you put out your books before, or do you just sort of start with the world or characters based on the story?
I sort of do a bit of each. I've just drafted my 2026 novel, which is a sci-fi kind of return to space, sort of, the members of the family closest to it are Aurora and Illuminae. And for that one, I did some of the world building and created some of the characters, and then I did a big outline. And my outlines contain stuff they pull a cool stunt. And then I get there and I'm past Amie, why are you like this? What cool stunt?
You haven't helped me.
You haven't helped me at all. No. And in this case, it's there's a lot of cool stunts. There's a lot of action sequences, and there's a lot of they trick them in a really cunning way. And I'm if you didn't know past Amie, how am I supposed to know? Okay. And then as I write, I sort of learn more about the characters through putting them in those situations. So I just, the other day, had an editorial call with my editor, and she was saying, I get this really strong sense of, this about, I'm trying not to spoil it, of this aspect of her personality later, but not so much earlier. I'm I didn't know when I was drafting the start that was true, and I figured it out in answer to these situations. So,
do you have a way that you build your worlds or your characters in each book that's the same across all your books? Or
it depends. I think if anyone would like the really long answer on this, I have a podcast called Amie Kaufman on Writing, and the first 2 episodes are about world building, and then a bunch of others are as well. I think I'm always looking for what are the little things that are different from our world and what ripples do those cause. But I also like to leave some blank spots on the map so that as I write and think, oh, okay, like how are they going to pull a cunning stunt? Well, I can think about like what would be an aspect of this world that would allow them to do that or this, or so it's kind of this like braid where I'm building the outline and I'm creating the characters and I'm building the world all at once to serve each other so that they feel really integrated.
And you're sort of not locked into a plan that's you've done before you even know your world and your characters.
Right, and then you're like, well, I can't do that. And it's like, you can, though, because you made this up. It's your story, girl. But you forget that if you dig too deep, I think.
What advice would you give to a writer working on their first book?
Oh, I mean, my first advice is always, writer working on your first book, finish it. If you finish it, it is already better than 99% of books that have ever been written. And that sounds glib, but the reason that I say it is because, you never want to give hard advice, because the thing is everyone works differently, and so many writers have wasted years of their lives trying to follow something that someone like me just sort of glibly said, and they're like, well, it must be a rule, she said it with great confidence, and it doesn't work for them. So on the whole, I would say try and avoid going back and revising as you work, but the little asterisk is, for some writers that's necessary. I think most people know in their hearts, is this truly my process, or am I just delaying getting onto the next bit? And the reason I always say, try to get a rough draft down first, and like it can be rough as guts, is that it's like you're building a body. And if your first 2 chapters are just the hand, and you carefully build the hand, and you do the skin, and you do the fingernails, and you put on the friendship bracelets and whatever, and then you continue writing and later you realise, oh no, this hand is like twice the size it needs to be, you're either going to have to cut all of that incredibly hard work, or more likely you won't cut it because you worked so hard on it, and you'll end up with something, like this perfect body, this giant hand, like one of those things they use to cheer at sports, and which is the only time you should have a giant hand. And so I think, if you just sort of build the whole skeleton first, then you are going to know how to then come back and work out, is it roughly the right size? Okay, now I put the muscle on, now I put the skin on. So that's my kind of general advice, but like I always want to say when I give advice, also don't listen to me. If that feels deeply wrong for you, if something in your body just went, then don't listen to me, because there's always more than one way to do it.
Everyone has their own process, and you learn that as you go along.
You do learn it as you go along, and I think we all want there to be a process.
Yes.
Like, even, I'm 20 novels deep. I would love to know the magic trick, but every book demands its own process. At a moment there when I save my words for the page.
Have you had a really important lesson that you've learned through your writing journey?
Ooh. I mean, the glim answer is always back your work up, because always back your work
That would
up.
be stressful if you lost them.
My friends, yeah, I'm not ready to talk about it, but always back your work up. But beyond that, I would say what I've really had to really internalize is nothing's ever wasted. That I have, I started The Isles of the Gods in May 2013, and I thought I had it. I had the characters, I had the world, it all came very fully formed to me, and I, raced down, I was like, this is going to be incredible. Got to go red hot 2 chapters in and hit a wall, because I wasn't good enough yet. And I think that, it would have been very easy for me to have tossed that book and never thought of it again, but instead I kept coming back to it over the years, and eventually I was good enough. And, I have a junior series, The World Between Blinks. The title of that is a line lifted from a tossed manuscript. Everything ends up being useful for something, and there's a fine line between hanging on to stuff to the extent that your arms are full and you can't take anything new on. You don't want to do that, but also, I guess, I've learned not to feel that sense of frustration when I toss something. So I'm like, it'll come back around. Life is long.
Got a little bucket full of things that you can just, scraps that you can pull through.
Yeah.
And nothing, you've got character ideas or anything that can actually be used.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just the experience of having done that work made me better, in some way. It taught me something, even because doing what doesn't work also teaches you. So it's annoying, but it does teach you.
There's lessons everywhere. Annoying.
Some of them you can live without, but there are lessons everywhere. Oh, my husband. Hands down, my husband. When I first sold my first book, you know, I had a day job and I would write on the train on the way to work, and then I couldn't write on the train on the way home because it was standing room only, so I would think. I would come home, we would hang out for like an hour or two, and, you know, I would then change into my PJs and go and write from like, you know, 8 till midnight every night, and he would just sort of bring me cups of tea, and then I would write on the weekends because I still had a full-time job, and also I'd sold this novel, so like I had to do both. And he, you know, it would have been so easy to complain, like, you know, it wasn't what he signed up for, it wasn't his dream, but he just unwaveringly supported me. And then when we sold Illuminae and it was clear it was time to start writing full-time for a little while, if only because there were not enough hours in the day, you know, he was incredibly supportive of that, and he still is. You know, he's still, you know, when I hit a deadline, our lives rearrange for a couple of weeks, and, you know, he never complains about it. He's just amazing, I think. You know, you see a lot of first books dedicated to a spouse,
Yes.
and that's for a reason. It's because, you know, your partner is the only one who's in it with you to that extent. So yeah, 100% my husband.
They're always there to sort of support and cheer you on.
Oh.
Even for supplying you food and drink when needed.
Seriously, every time he'll be like, you can do what you want. He's learned not to. But I'm just wondering, do you think sleep at this point might help you get some more done? Yeah. So he's the best. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.